Let's start with a simple, maybe even a shocking premise. What if I told you that almost everything you've been taught about how to learn, how to really study, is just wrong? I want you to think about your go-to method. The late nights, rereading your notes over and over, highlighting half the textbook. What if all that hard work, all that time, was actually one of the worst ways to remember anything long-term? Yeah, there's a name for that. It's called passive review, and it is the ultimate comfort trap. See, it feels like you're being productive, right? The words on the page start to look familiar. But here's the catch. You're mistaking that feeling of familiarity for actual knowledge, and trust me, it's a total illusion. So, to really get why this fails so badly, we have to flip the script. We don't need to look at the science of learning, not yet. We need to look at the science of forgetting. Because, let's be honest, your brain is an absolute expert when it comes to hitting the delete button. And there's hard evidence for this. Way back in the 19th century, a psychologist named Hermann Ebbinghaus discovered something pretty startling about our memory. He mapped it all out, and we now call it the forgetting curve. And what it shows is just how ridiculously fast our brain throws out new information if we don't actively fight to keep it. And when you see the numbers, it's pretty brutal. Think about this. Within just 1 hour of learning something, you've probably already lost half of it. A day later, 70% gone. And after a week, a staggering 90% of that information has just vanished. Poof. And this is exactly why cramming for a test feels so terrible and honestly doesn't work. You're basically fighting a losing battle against that curve. Sure, you might get this temporary spike in memory, just enough to get through the exam, but it leads to absolutely zero long-term retention. It is the most inefficient way to learn anything. Okay. So this means we need a totally new way of thinking about memory. The old model, the one we all kind of grew up with, is that your brain is like a storage box. You just put information in it. But that's a weak, inefficient model. The new model, the correct model, is to think of your memory as a muscle. A muscle doesn't get stronger by just looking at it, right? It grows when you force it to work, when you put it under resistance. And that idea, that's what brings us to the solution, a real system that's actually built on the science of how your brain is wired to work. And listen, this isn't about working harder. It's all about training smarter. So the big shift here is to stop using brute force, those endless hours of just staring at your notes, and instead adopt a smart, scientific system. So let's break the system down. All right, pillar number 1 of the system is something called active recall. It's so simple, but it's a game changer. Instead of rereading a page, you do this. You close the book. And you force your brain to pull that information out of thin air. You ask yourself, okay, what were the main points? What was the big idea? That is the mental equivalent of lifting a heavy weight. And this leads us to the single most important rule of this whole thing. You need to burn this into your brain. If it feels easy, you aren't learning. That struggle, that feeling of, oh, what was it again? That's not failure. That is the moment of learning. That effort is literally what's building and strengthening the connections in your brain. If there's no struggle, there's no growth. Simple as that. Now, for the second pillar, spaced repetition. If active recall is the workout, then spaced repetition is the schedule. This is our weapon, our direct counterattack against that forgetting curve we talked about. It's basically an algorithm for your brain. You're not just reviewing stuff whenever you feel like it, you're strategically reviewing it right at the moment you're about to forget. And look, this isn't just some nice theory. This is the exact system used by people in the most demanding fields you can imagine. We're talking medical students who have to memorize thousands of anatomical terms, or polyglots who are learning entire new languages. They review at these increasing intervals, say after 1 day, then again after 3 days, then a week, a month. Each time they're catching that memory just before it disappears and making it stronger. So that's the whole system right there. It's really just 2 parts. Step 1 is the query. That's active recall, where you're forcing your brain to pull up the data. And step 2 is the algorithm, spaced repetition, where you're timing those queries perfectly. You put them together, and you transform learning from this passive, lazy thing into an active process of literally building your memory. And what we're talking about here, it goes way beyond just a few study hacks. This is about taking conscious, deliberate control of how you learn. It's about shifting your mindset from a student to an engineer of your own memory. So, how do you know if you've really engineered something well? You run a test. And the ultimate test, the final quality check for your understanding, is called the Feynman technique. It's beautiful because it's so simple. Can you explain a complex concept in really simple terms? Like, could you explain it to a 5-year-old? If you can't do that without using a bunch of jargon, then you don't really get it yourself. And that reveals a really powerful truth, doesn't it? Complexity is often just a mask for ignorance. People hide behind big words when they don't really understand something. True mastery isn't about making things complicated. It's about distillation. It's about finding that simple, powerful core of an idea. So, I'll leave you with this. Amateurs cram. They just throw information at their brain and hope some of it sticks. Professionals, on the other hand, they engineer their memory. They build a system. The goal isn't just to consume data anymore. The goal is to install it. So the only question left is, what are you going to install?